Hello again. Once again, I've invited Mrs. Varley along to talk with Ian and I because she's been doing work with another class in her school, the Cape, and this time, I think, with a team of other teachers that...
Yes, there were 3 of us working on this particular project. There was an MA student, Guy Williams, who's responsible for the majority of the work here, myself and Mr. Shanti Sharma, who was the class teacher.
And the class is something of the same social mix, is it? And,
Very much so, yes, here they...
And they're older than our...
Yes, these are 10-year-olds.
Yes, yes, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Now, I met this class only twice, I remember.
Right.
And all the rest of the work you've followed on with the team.
That's right. Yes,
Good. Now, in this work, I don't want to take you what we were dealing with in the last tutorial, Ian. Mm-hmm. I'm assuming from that very brief encounter you can see what I've been saying is borne out in practice.
You're right.
But what I want to do this time is to try to give you some guidelines by which you can check that the way you're planning the work is developing coherently. You see, much planning is done on the basis of how the outside looks. If they've done that, they ought to do that next, because that looks right. Mm-hmm. But that isn't the way it works at all. The way it works, Ian, is the experience they now have, because they've just been engaged here, what is the next logical experience to take? So you're looking much more internally at the development of work. And some of this may emerge in the work you've done. You may have been developing it externally rather than internally, because we learn all the time as we try this way of working. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this statement about internal coherence. You see, most people, when they plan work for children, they think the word logical is to do with how it looks. If you decide, for example, in this case we're dealing with Tudors and Stuarts, because that was the curriculum demand, wasn't it?
Yes.
For this particular age range in the historical work. You think if we were, for example, designing dolls for a Tudor house shop or something like that, that the next thing would be to make the costumes.
That's right, yes.
Well, that is externally coherent, but it's not internally coherent, because designing dolls to sell in a shop is where you look. How do you display so that people realise these are genuine Tudor material, in that we've researched these carefully? So you see, the next logical step you may make is to look at Tudor art, to look at the way faces were painted in those days. This is the only evidence we have. So internally you'd go to other paintings, which seems illogical. Here they are on dolls, and suddenly you want them to look at Tudor faces. And that would seem silly, but to me that's sensible, because I'm teaching about Tudors and Stuarts. So it's logically organised from the inside of the children's experience. It is consistent, each stage is consistent with the stage that's just gone before. Internally, it's consistent to look at Tudor paintings if you're making Tudor dolls. Not because Tudor outsides matter. The second thing is it's comprehensible to the receiver. The child finds it logical to do it, not, I thought we were doing this and suddenly we're engaged in doing that. The next one is that the internal, i.e. existing within the structure, develops without any dissonant factors for the child. Dissonant factors for the child. Now, this often creates a lot of confusion when you try to explain to colleagues why you want this to do next, why you want to follow this next. You see, in terms of a Tudor shop, We've done dolls, now we'll do pomanders.
Mm.
Now that is only internally coherent if we are considering our clients and what they might like to take away with them. Now in that context, doing pomanders after dolls is internally coherent because we are saying what will help people take something away that really is about Tudorness. But just to do it because, well, we did an art and craft lesson last week and it was a doll, and this week it's going to be a pomander, is not internally coherent. It only looks like it when you put it on a timetable. Am I making a little bit of sense on that? Now, in our case, when I began with the children, the sort of internal coherence, and I'll go on to try and show you how it worked, was first of all I offered them an external stimulus, which we'll go into in a minute. Then I offered them something they must manipulate. Once I'd given them that stimulus, they had to manipulate it, so that it became theirs, not mine. The third stage they had to do was to get a result out of their manipulation. I've got to help them feel, oh, I've done something here. I got something done. Then I've got to offer them the chance to have another think about it, to self-correct it. And finally, to be committed to saying, yes, I believe that to be true. In history terms, I believe what I've just done there is true. You gave me a problem. I manipulated and worked myself around that problem. I now have a result for my answer. I now am going to modify it because I can get some more information. And finally, I'll stand by my result. Now that's what we're going to be talking about in this tutorial, Ian. And so I want to try to introduce you, based in this, to this system here that I've written up. Now I find this is a very useful way of checking what are they needing of the teacher right now in order to go through those stages which I've mentioned before, whereby there is rigour in the work, there's responsibility in the work, and there's realisation in the work. Realisation comes at this point when you say, I stand by that, that's what I stand by. So, first of all, it seems to me that in our case now, we're going to look at Tudor and Stuart historical material. That was my brief from your school. I have to find a frame for it, a point of view. This is always consistent because we've chosen a drama approach. It is going to be actively engaged with, identifying with the material now. Not with thinking about how interesting it might be to run a Tudor mansion, but we're running one now. There's your drama input. I do apologise if I'm repeating myself, but I find that it has to keep on being said. It's the radical basis of why it comes out this way that I'm on about. Now, in my case, you see, I decided, you very graciously gave me the permission to do this, as you did with the other work in your school, to choose my context. And the frame I chose, that these 10-year-old children should become totally responsible over a period of time to run a Tudor manor house, just as the National Trust would demand of their employees if they were running a Tudor manor house. Now, I did this because it seemed to me it would offer me the Tudors and the Stuarts, because the building is there still when the Stuart people come along, just as we can go and see it today in our century. Now, I always look for the material I just have to hand. And usually there is something that you, as you assemble your knowledge, you think, where could I begin? And I remembered, of course, visiting Trerice with my young daughter in Cornwall and being thrilled by this particular book. There's an authenticity about it. It isn't antiseptic. It isn't a camera, it's a painterly eye. The lady has sat in this mansion and she's muddled it up. She hasn't said, oh, I'm afraid to put that vase of flowers in because it isn't strictly Tudor Stuart. She said a house is a living organic thing, and what I paint, some of it can go right back to the very beginning, and some of it is put in just yesterday. And so I thought, right, I will use this as my model. And of course at this point I knew nothing about the class except that they would be 10 years old and that they were already engaged in doing Tudors and Stuarts here. Now, how did you come to be involved in it?
I can't keep my nose up, basically.
Ah, right. Yes.
I felt that Shanti, who I'm very good friends with at school,
Is Shanti the teacher?
Shanti's the teacher, yes, Mr. Sharma. He hadn't used drama ever, and I thought it would be a wonderful opportunity to acquaint him with, you know, drama as a learning medium.
Yes.
And then the whole thing just snowballed because we ended up working not only just with Shanti's class, but with my class as well. So we had 60 children running Therese House and
Very
3
nice.
teachers, which was
Yes.
a very nice way of team teaching.
I'm comfortable with that, Ian, because 60, of course with 3 teachers you happen to have one who can come in now and again. I'm comfortable because I think the Manor House can use a lot of people.
Yeah.
You know, you need a lot of people. You're not going to run short of people because, you know, by putting 2 classes together, that's a very, very nice, a very nice idea. Now then, this model, first of all, it seems to me, when I start some work, I have to spend teacher time in orientating the children firmly in the direction we are going to go. Now, the one I chose was, we'll get our Tudor eye in. Now, that seems to me the absolute heart of getting interested in history. That when you get a Tudor eye, you have it forever. It doesn't matter where you are, you can, that's got a Tudor look to it. Or, you know, that's almost a Tudor. That's almost a Tudor design in that dress, because you can see Tudor designs in modern clothes. You see, so that Tudor eye is something you carry forever. I thought if I could get them into that, I've done the history curriculum for Tudors and Stuarts that will stand them in good stead for the rest of any history they do. The sense of the period, not the facts of the period. You can go on all your life collecting facts, but to get the sense early would seem to me marvellous, you see. So the first thing is, how will I orientate the children towards Tudors? That was my first one. The second thing is, what sort of information will I collect together? What resources will I employ so that they get genuine Tudor input, not mucked up, blandified, stultified, only thin, crusty facts on the top. So I begin to cast about for, you know, what will be my input material. Now, I have an instinct that my input material must be of the real world, not done for school children. My job is to make it interpretable by school children. So I may be a bit awkward here. I tend at first to just ignore the stuff that's put out for kids, as you might say, and I look for the genuine material, and then I have to look at how I can do it and use it. So, of course, I make some work for myself. And, you know, I have to put up with that. I'm prepared to tolerate that work because in the long run I'll get more travel out of it and so on. So when you think of your input systems that you've been using, that you instinctively rely on, that's the most important thing first. What do you best rely on when you want to feed children ways of getting information as well as the information itself? And of course I've already told you what my instinct is. Go to the real world. rather than the stuff produced for children. I won't ask you today what your instinct would be. Before we'd had all these tutorials, what would you have looked for about the Tudors and Stuarts? Now, obviously, roles are a way of giving input. We saw in your last tutorial how documents are a way of giving giving information. Old letters, archives, people's memories. Not that we've got anybody who can remember the Tudors, but they may have memories of being in a Tudor house, and so on and so on. Obviously, you've got your own understanding of knowledge, and sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's weak, and sometimes it's plain wrong. So I have to watch myself on what's plain wrong, what I think is right for the Tudors. Pictures are an amazing source of material, and we are so blessed in our time with what is available because of printing. We are so blessed, and you don't see an awful lot of children muddling through art, ferreting through paintings, when you think of how much is available that we can bring into school. Charts, for example, this chart here, that information is absolutely correct. I couldn't get it like that. That can do it for me. So I'm all the time saying, what sort of an input system have I got available? And how much variety have I got? I mean, if we look here, just what I've got here, we've got the history of Windsor Castle, we've got how to make potpourri, we've got the history of perfumes, we've got a recipe book of the Stuart times, and we've got John West's new work on information for children based upon actual places. In this case, something on the Tudors and Stuarts. Now, when I decide on my input system then, I have to think of, when all this input is coming at them, what will they be doing? So they're holding on to it, not copying it out. They have to be somehow able to latch into it, do some sort of task, so that it doesn't just drift past on yesterday's tide, which is what so much does. And that holding system, because it's drama, gives us an amazing variety of things people can do, because they're being in this frame. And of course the next thing is, it's all right having a holding system, but you've got to process it then forward. So if, for example, I read a recipe, I spend some time with some children deciphering, you know, how to jug a hare, and looking at all this peculiar spelling. Well, there's my input system. The holding system may be how we talk together, but the processing system might be doing something on the implications. If she can jug a hare like that in 1614 or whatever, what does it mean she had in the house? Now that would be an example of a processing system. She must have had heat. She must have had a source of heat. She must have had vessels. What can we glean from this recipe about how she saw vessels as big, small, were they called gallons? What kinds of evidence is there? This is the processing system. So when we've ended that little bit of work just up to there, what we seem to have is just a list of what that lady had in the house. And people are saying to you probably, well, you never got onto the recipe. You got off the recipe. You'd never jugged a hare. If you'd have copied it out, it would have been more like you knew it. But of course what we have is an envisaging of a kitchen now, without which you cannot use a recipe. There has to be somewhere to make this transformation, this alchemy of cooking. So seeing the vessels is internally coherent for dealing with a jugged hare. The next stage, of course, is this process of realisation. Now, in terms of Mrs. Sperling's receipt book, realisation might take the form of, let's have a look at some Tudor kitchens in pictures, or a list of things, or go to a Tudor house. In this case, you went to a Tudor house at one stage, I know, and you considered the layout when you've got big frocks on. They don't all have to look like Queen Elizabeth, for goodness sake, but they are in bulky clothes. I mean, I'm built for it, you know. I mean, you're not, but I am. So the business of how is the heat kept going through the night? Where are the vessels stored? How are they cleaned? And so on. There's your realisation. We now can write, for running this Tudor house, our view of how we think cooking went on. We're nowhere near the jugged hare. We've come from the jugged hare. So is this making sense to you? Through the processing, the realisation. And then we need a practising time. Now that's when it might look more like drama. How do people, if some are carrying buckets of water from well springs and spring wells or wherever, and others are stoking the fire, and we know what sort of wood we're using, or whether we indeed have got coal, because there was coal available if you lived near a seam, an open, what we call an open cast seam. How were the orders given, and how would a jugged hare get done? Who skins it? Where does the skin go? What happens to everything? So you see, your practising time might well look like, let's feel like a Tudor manor house, and we'll make some cooking. We're not going to really jug a hare. That would get in the way, because people are going, ooh, you know, all the time. But we can keep stopping it and saying, how far have you got with that? Somebody else is laying the table. Somebody else is looking at the way the hierarchy would work on the board, as you might say. Does this make sense? And then, of course, what is your reinforcing and recognising system? It's there because we run a Tudor house. We can say to people, come and join us in a Tudor kitchen. Or we can say, we have made some drawings of how we think cooking went on. And you can, if you care to buy the leaflet, see a good Tudor recipe for a jugged hare. And this is how we know it's a Tudor recipe. Because we went to an original book. And we can look at the spelling, the layout, and receipt we can translate into recipe. And so on. Does that make a little bit of sense? So this is what I'm using when I'm teaching, and I'll give you some more schemes later. But have I done enough reinforcing, is what you're asking. What system of reinforcing could I use on this that's internally coherent to it? Now, I've only given you one model. I'm not saying you have to do what I did. I'm saying that that's the way I think when I'm trying to use this system. Has there been enough practising time?
Will you, in terms of the children's behaviour, is it evident to you where they're at in that system?
Yes. Particularly, well, their social behaviour one is looking at all the time. The way I am holding them within the Tudor running the house, the framing is always in the context of running the house. And you see, it's an absolute gift. It's a dead easy one, in fact, is this. Because the people who run National Trust houses are there to educate. They see it as their task to share information, to share knowledge, to enthuse other people. Surely that's what we want the children to do. To have a purpose in knowing what they know by teaching it to somebody else. You don't have to constantly have somebody in to teach, but you're to have in the mind's eye all the time everything we do here, the standards we apply here, how we speak here, what we decide to show people here, is because we understand the Tudors and the Stuarts.
In this particular project, Guy Williams actually told the children, because he was the area manager, he was enrolled as area manager, that a party of French children were going to come across, and they had to leave Therese House actually knowing all the names of the Tudor and Stuarts kings and queens, and their way of life. And the children had to really think as to what kind of language they were going to use, because these were French children. English was a second language to them. So they had this sort of like double task there, not only to impart the information, but also think very, very carefully as to the type of language that was going to be used so that the children could actually understand what was going on.
Yeah. And of course, why should French children be even remotely interested in Tudor kings and queens? Which is a lovely problem for them to have to solve. That's really nice. Now, you see, if you think that a holding system, I mean, you can do your own thinking carefully when you have more time. How many ways are there of holding? I mean, the children here were transferring things into folders. Now, it can be a temporary holding, like shove it in there in case I lose it.
Oh, no.
Or it can be an organising situation, which is where does this fit now, so that it's interpretable by somebody else who sees it. How far does this holding system demand a very specific kind of language? How far does it demand a specific kind of layout? I mean, that's one holding system. But a building up of vocabulary in a dictionary is another kind of holding system, that you can, in fact, refer to any of these strange words and you'll find meanings there. The holding system is what you can then refer to, but the processing system is as you make the dictionary and keep on rebuilding and refining it and getting it more complex. So they blur into each other all the time.
Something I've actually learnt from this is that I really have never given the children enough time to have this processing system, which is so important. That's a big realisation that I've had. We don't give them time to manipulate and experiment and become familiar with. You know, you sort of give out the information, then expect it to come back at you in exactly the same form that you want it.
Yes.
And the processing system was a real eye-opener for me, just how much time the children do need to be able to, to manipulate the materials, to think about them, to talk about them, to get used to the feel of them.
Now, of course, people may think that the time you spend on this is going to have to be duplicated the next time you do a project, but it isn't.
Or they've learned it once.
Because they've learned it. So that sort of processing will be available to them. I mean, with your children, I taught them 2 lessons.
Yes.
By the end of the second lesson, I reckon I was in a position to keep saying, well, remember the implications. I had to teach the implications in the first lesson. But just remember the implications, it became shorthand. Now, I find children saying back to me, not necessarily your class, okay, I've been thinking about the implications of this. So that's a life skill forever.
They transfer it to everything else.
Yes, yes. So in fact it is not using more time. In fact, in many cases it's using less, because you're building in a kind of density, a spiralling, which is quite hard to conceive of in a short talk like this. Anyway, for example, doing a summing up. Somebody's standing there and saying, well, I've written these notes, I'm going to give you a quick summing up of what I've learned about what a Tudor chair or whatever it might be. That is a processing system, which then becomes a process of realisation, because I'm telling you about it. And you can ask me any questions and I'll try and deal with them. And the asking of the questions is the processing system for the other people, you see. So all these are ways I have of reviewing the work. Am I catching it up? Am I giving enough time for this? Have I skimmed too fast here? There was an example in the Mary Morgan work with your class where I knew I was trying too quickly, but I reached for it in case. When we were in the cemetery, I asked the graves, the children were representing the graves, if they ever saw anything happen. I wanted to see if they wanted ghosts. And I got this classic remark, does much happen here around you? And the child said, not much. So I went to the next one. I knew
It started.
Went to the next one. When you are standing here in the cemetery, is there much, do the winds blow through? Not much.
30
And I
not
got
muches.
not much from every child. And it was a superb example of Hesketh landing herself. But you see, you can reach for something and see if it'll work.
Yes.
But you can't say, oh, well, the first child says not much, so I'll stop it. I had to go systematically through to honour each child. And the sensible kids all said the same answer. Do you ever see any ghosts around here? Not much. Do any leaves ever blow around here? Not much. Nothing much happened. That's why the gate creaked. And it's a lovely example of too early going for a process of realisation, because I haven't done anything about the input. You can't speak as a gravestone if you don't understand what you represent. A lovely example. And, you know, you hit it every time. Now, the realisation system is when you're getting it outside of yourself. What am I doing to help the children get this outside of themselves? They're not now directly engaged with it, they're directly engaged with what it is going to somebody else, or into a book, or whatever you use, into our shop, and so on. So this is what we're going to be dealing with. Now then, let's have a look at some of the tasks I asked the children to do, and we'll start to apply this. I decided, for good or ill, it's the Tudor eye. And I thought, where can I begin? And this is a matter of honour. You can't deny children the best that you're capable of. So in thinking back to what could be the very first threshold, it seemed to me to get this realisation that our kings and queens of Britain have had family names just like we have. And so I thought, my orientation system is having these words, which I cut up for the children. My input system is they are correct. And I'm saying them, and you can see them at the same time. Now, I didn't show them this. I kept that in case I needed to photocopy more. I said, you find on here all the names of the family names of people who, all our kings and queens have surnames like we have. And so I thought it would be interesting to put them in some sort of order. Now there's your processing system. The holding system is these don't change for the moment. I can keep changing them about, but the names don't fade. You know, the ink isn't going to fade off after a minute. The processing system is, can you put them in order? So you see, there's the external stimulus. So when we look at this lesson, you were there. What was happening to the children in terms of learning as they sought out Lancaster and so on. Now you just think, I'll talk like I heard some of them. No, that Lancaster goes before Tudor. No, it doesn't. And they were doing this all the time. York's a place. Or put it there, it'll do. These kind of things were going on. Because I've said Plantagenet, everybody knows how to read it. If they were listening. Windsor. Frequently Windsor came right at the front. And I think it became at the front because they felt there's something about Windsor, the name Windsor strikes a bell, so it goes at the front. Not this very complicated thing that Windsor now goes at the back. Now Windsor looks like it should go to the front. It goes at the back. Now then, you look at what was being processed there. The holding system is being done through laying it down, but then we have to come to a process of realisation and some more input. The first input is this, the second input is this. Now I register, have I got this internally coherent? Now if you say, no, it's better to show them the chart and explain the chart, I will say to you, but they haven't done anything to be interested in it yet.
But it satisfies your conscience.
But
You've
it
got it
satisfies
across.
my conscience. Yes, I've done it. I've got the chart, and it's a good chart, you see. There's a
Historical.
weakness in this chart because the chart is old. I can't remember its date, but you see, Queen Elizabeth II should be a lot taller now because she's lived a lot longer. But because that's how it is in Osborne, I have no right to change it, and I haven't anything better. So I use that. I like it because it's visual. It shows a mathematical proportion as well as the years in numbers and so on.
Yeah.
So you see, when I'm looking at this, I'm saying, how can I make them interested enough in that to really study it? To know what they're looking for before they look at it. So I invent this. It's dead easy. I mean, it takes 10 minutes. Actually, it was the first time in my life I'd ever looked up all these family names. The Plantagenets, you know, I'd sort of vaguely knew from Shakespeare, but beyond that, you know, the House of York, I was saying, who's the House of York? So my education is already developing. Now, internally then, it was reasonable to say, come back and see whether there's any that need changing, not see where you were wrong. I mean, could you put them in right order instantly when handed them?
No.
I couldn't have done. And so we came to the second problem, you see, which was internally coherent. Now you've done all the families, this is just 2. But there's 14 of them. Can you put those in any logical order? Now here you heard the children using logic. Henry VII must have come before Henry VIII. But there was no Henry IX, I heard somebody say when they were. Is there a Henry IX? No, it suddenly all changes. So then we do the same process. Can you go back and check? Now they're looking at a very tiny bit of the chart, but I've started a sense of there's a very long history in our kings and queens, but the bit we're looking at is this. This must be quite boring to you, but I'm trying to show how I apply this. Now there's a bit more teacher preparation here, because now I want to create a practicing time. So I've invented a very crude game. As you realise, I've said before the present house of, and I'm using quite classic language, and you've got to lift it up. Now this one asks the children to go backwards, because my design of a process of realisation and a practice time, if you're going to study history, you can only do it from your own time. That's all you've got. You've got to have enough stimulus to want to go back. And in wanting to go back, you have to realise you can never know it as the people who lived there then knew it. But you can apply your imagination. You can scrutinise their evidence, but you belong to the 20th century. So I can't say to children, let's all be Tudor. That to me is a nonsense.
Yeah, they find that very difficult timeline. That's what I've noticed when we were doing this, that timeline was really...
There's a sense, though, when you go backwards, you are placing yourself in terms of the past. You are
deliberately
seeking your origins, you know, that's before me came.
That's right, but I am here now.
Yes.
And the historian is always here now, reaching for it, trying to grasp it. applying information, evidence, knowledge, but always reaching. We cannot live the lives we didn't, even though we may feel we've lived before.
I think what's interesting about that is it's something about focusing on the here and now and me, because I look backwards. I can look backwards.
Yes.
Whereas if you were doing it the other way around, leading from the back to the beginning, there's something about it being just an exercise, an activity that just maps something out in a sequential way that doesn't involve me.
That's right. And the child has been here in these three. It's a game element here. All my talk is of a game. The kinds of behaviours I'm producing at this stage is a game sense of, oh yes, that's interesting, you've had to put the Windsors all the way up to the front, rather like a race, you know. The thing is, you see, you place the child at the middle, the child as manipulator of their knowledge from the very beginning. I move these, I check that, I recheck this, I correct it, I don't feel wrong because I was wrong. I now search, and I know before the present, that's a very important word, House of Windsor. And of course it can be done as a whole class game, with the teacher lifting the flaps and everybody chorusing it, and it looks old-fashioned, but it may make it stick.
And it's time consuming.
Of course it is. But people could be honour bound to go and do that for themselves and keep going into their folder and checking and so on. You can't stand up in a Tudor mansion house and give the wrong information. So you'll get it right because you need to. But of course you have to follow some kids, haven't you? They don't do it on their own. It's got to be won out. So getting in your Tudor eye. Now you see, it appears I make a big jump. We play with all this, and I say, put them away safely. Put the rubber bands around, put the paper clips on, and don't lose them. Because in spin-off terms, can I get a game out of it? Can they invent a Tudor game? I don't know what it would be, because I'm not going to do the inventing. What will I be doing about this? And then I move to the second stage. Now I'm going to pull this down and show you again this design. I feel I'm chelping at you horribly, but you know, butt in. 4 things seem to me important that the children should grasp. One is that it was a time of great explorers. The world suddenly expanded. Another is there was the problem of the church and state and the divine right of kings. I don't think I could face the children if I didn't do something about that, because Henry is responsible for many of our laws, and he, of course, destroyed the monasteries, changed our national religion, if you like, so we can't afford to ignore it. And when we come on to Mary Tudor and later Elizabeth, this constant flux of religious pressure is terribly important, and I don't think tends too early. And running a manor house that may well have a priest hole in it is one of the ways, you see, in which it can be concretely understood. Another one is the social order of how did people live in those days, and of course this business of who has a right to be called a king, which I've already mentioned. So those 4 were in my mind when I thought of the development of this work, that all 4 must be equally followed. Though I then say to myself, where they've been to see a Tudor house, so I'm not starting with ships and Christopher Columbus. And so I say, well, what is the next stage? If you've put the families in order and now you have the kings and queens, where do they live? Now, the Tudor eye now is a list. The Tudor eye now is going to become visual. There is a Tudor ceiling. Have we got the capacity to see detail? Because this is one of the skills these children are going to have to learn. So, looking at detail, I need to diagnose. Do they just go up at something and say, well, I've seen that now, what else are you going to tell me? What skills do I need? What skills do you need to get them to look in more and more detail? Now, this sort of looking is a tremendous pressure on the teacher's mouth, because it isn't just a shape, it's how does it look when I'm underneath it? That's why these are so useful. But how low down is it over my head? It's to do with my body in the architectural setting of a Tudor house. So my mouth has to get into this a little bit. Your school happens to have some interesting arched doorways. So I had a gift there of how do they feel when you go through these thick walls in this Victorian school, even though they're not Tudor, but they've got a sense of not modern. So you see, it looks like it isn't coherent. But what I'm saying is, those people called Mary Tudor and Elizabeth I walked under ceilings like this. These are the places where she slept. Queen Elizabeth slept here and here and here and here. This is what she saw when she looked up. So I'm moving all the time into this business of the social order, because the kids live in a social order now. I feel I can get a grasp on this that will lead me to this. So I can delay this. I may be wrong, but that's my style. You might feel you know more about ships and Columbus. Okay, you can start there. So we now move to our inventories. Now, I gather the children worked on these inventories. Now, you see, again, I've gone to genuine inventories, 1598, Richard Arnold. Now, there's a coherence about it. The first list is very short. He was a yeoman's son. He didn't have much to leave. The second one, though, is a husbandman, and look how much he owns. The third are the household accounts, how much things like this cost. And then we come on to a much bigger one, which is how much he spent in a certain year. And finally, the church, because I'm going for matters ecclesiastical at some point. Now here you see, if you look at this, I don't have to bother about the orientation system so much, because we started it with our kings and queens. We know we're into Tudor eyes. So my input system. Now I am working in a drama mode. I can't say, pin your ears back. I'm going to read you the inventory of Richard Arnold. What I have to say is, I think when we have the public in to see Therese House, some of the things they might be interested in are what sort of people might have moved around this place. And I thought maybe, see what you think.
They actually hot-seated Richard Arnold.
Tell us about it.
There's, excuse me, I'll just get to me. Let me get this right now, my processing system.
Yeah, well, don't worry too much about that. I'm showing it at Ian.
They hot-seated Richard Arnold and
Now,
asked
did you
him,
have a role?
Yes, Guy, the MA student from Birmingham Poly that came in, played the part of Richard Arnold, and it was very, very interesting because he took on the accent, he took on the, you know, his sort of whole demeanour, the way he sat and everything, and the children were absolutely spellbound.
Yeah.
You know,
Did you dress him in full role?
No, not in full
So he
role,
took on
no.
the demeanour?
Yes.
Yes, now there you can remember back.
Yeah.
And part of the actual drama context was that 3 men were from Trerise House, of which Richard Arnold was one, because he was a gardener at Trerise House. We made him out to be a gardener. We're going to go and fight for the king. And the children wanted to know, well, why did he have to go to war? And he felt because he didn't have a family, nobody needed him around Trerise, so, you know, he could go. But some of the things that actually came out, excuse me, for me was, you know, what did we find out from Hot Seating Richard Arnold? That it's good to die for your country. That you always do what more intelligent people tell you to do. I mean, that takes you into a whole area of social communication there. He told them that he'd never actually set foot inside Trerise House because at that time the poor people were kept out. And, you know, poor people were not always treated with dignity and respect. So that set the
It's a very septic product, in fact, isn't it? For some reason, we've got the business of him going to war, and then what did you eat? What do you eat? Which is interesting.
It seemed important from them, yes.
How did you feel when your father died? And so on and so on. So that's a very interesting example. Now, the input system is coming now from the role. But the children are putting as much in as the role is. The holding system, presumably, is they need it for Trerise House. So they have to be careful they don't neglect any of these answers. There's a purpose in it. Now, the processing system, presumably, was getting this down, going through all his answers and later, retrospectively, writing it. I mean, presumably they didn't write it at the time.
No.
The process of realisation, presumably, would be as you spoke with them at the time about it. Now, did you do anything, or have you been able to do anything yet about the practising time? You needn't have, because these things,
I haven't at the moment.
you know, you can't take everything up at once. A practising time there that might emerge because you want it. He said we were never allowed inside the great hall. So you see, you might at that point take up that and do a technical drawing of Trerise House and all the layout of the outstanding farms, the outlying farms, the herb garden, the knot garden, so that you reinforce internally coherently the social order.
That's right. Yes.
So it looks wrong. Suddenly, you know, we dismiss a fella, we write this up, and we start on a technical drawing, for goodness sake, of a great Tudor house, of which there are many good technical drawings available to help us, to give us models of it. And finally, you see, your reinforcing and recognising system would be how you use that in Trerise when we run it. Now, there is a muddle here. We're using Trerise Cornwall when really they ought to invent their own Tudor house, so that we don't get muddled between an actual house that would have this sort of garden in Cornwall and ours, which could well be in the Midlands because this is where we know, you see. So there's a little bit of niggle in me that I didn't get that established to invent, you know, their own house. Now, I believe at this stage it's very historically sound, as long as that role doesn't start embroidering up and starting fantasising about things, because it'll be planted so clearly for the children. It'll go in really deep. See, it very quickly goes into deep memory because it's an interesting adventure. So he better be careful what he says, and so on. Now then, have you any other examples of work that they did with you? We've just got a few minutes where we can say, there's an example of moving in, there was an orientation system, there was an input system. For example, the work on Polonius and the work from Shakespeare.
Yes.
How did you deal with that? You talk to Ian about it, and I'll just see.
It was basically when Richard Arnold was leaving Therese House to go to war to fight for the king. How do people actually say their goodbyes? What's the best way of saying goodbye to somebody? And it, you know, led from all sorts of things, you know, the way children say goodbye to the parents and whatever have you. And Guy suggested, this is another example of how, you know, sort of how limited my thinking on it was. Let's try this piece of Shakespeare. And I said, what, Shakespeare with 10-year-olds? You've got to be joking, haven't you? Well, come on, let's just try it. So I said, OK, you know, on your back be it.
It's a superb example of internal coherence. They've just said goodbye to a man who's going to say goodbye to his father, and here you have a father saying goodbye to his son.
So, you know, we read it,
Yes.
and I thought they'll never be able to cope with this. And then we had them working in groups, and the three of us went round the various groups, and we just said to the children, well, just write down what, or tell us, because I mean, in some cases I was doing the writing for them, what do you think it actually means in today's language? And you've got some
Yes.
evidence there.
I wish you luck, my son. I wish you to come back. I don't want to miss you. My blessings are with you. If you die, I won't live without you. I would like to know something. The ship is something, you have it. I haven't had a chance to read all these. Now, what has happened here then, if we're thinking of this internal coherence and this processing system, is there's one consistent thing happening, and I think Ian's got the message. If you use good material, it works. It really works. And if it's used in context, there are no barriers put up. You don't have to say, now look, Shakespeare is really very difficult. And he's printed in this double column stuff on thin rice paper. And only people who are 16 ever could read this. You simply say, you know, when that soldier was having to say goodbye to his dad, I found a dad saying goodbye to his son. And I thought, how interesting, we've got somebody doing just the opposite.
And what I found very interesting for myself was that the children who were very poor readers, their interpretation of the text when I read it to them and I did the writing for them was marvellous. Absolutely marvellous. What you know, the way they understood it, the way they empathised with it, you know, what it would be like to have your son go away.
Yeah.
It was such a learning experience.
Well,
for
I
them.
do
It's-
believe, you know, we're born, we look so little, and some of us grow very big, but we look so little, but we are programmed for learning like this. We are programmed for the storing of human experience, and we are programmed to be interested in all the marvellous knowledge that humans have collected. I believe it. So I can't give them mishmash, pobs. Why can't they share in the knowledge of somebody like Shakespeare? On that note, Ian, we shall continue to your next tutorial.
Gosh.